In the autumn of 1918, the mighty German Empire, the same power that had crushed armies from the Baltic to the Balkans, was suddenly collapsing from within. Soldiers who once marched under the proud banner of the Kaiser now deserted in the thousands. The front lines were disintegrating, the ports were in open revolt, and a stunned Europe watched as a nation that had seemed invincible just a year earlier begged for peace. How could the strongest army in the world crumble so completely, so suddenly? To understand Germany's defeat in the First World War, we have to look beyond the trenches and the barbed wire. The end of the German Empire was not just the story of a battlefield lost, it was the unraveling of an entire system of belief. In August 1914, Germany entered the war with unmatched military prestige, brilliant generals, and one of the best-trained armies on the planet. It had already outpaced its neighbors industrially and scientifically. Its soldiers marched to the front under the confident illusion that the war would be short, that German planning and precision would outmaneuver the chaos of modern conflict. But 4 years later, in November 1918, that confidence had turned to despair. The Kaiser was gone. The army was broken, and a new republic was born, amid the ruins of a nation humiliated and starving. The reasons for this downfall are not simple, and they cannot be explained by numbers alone. The Allies had more men, more money, and more time, but Germany's defeat came as much from within as from without. It was the consequence of miscalculations, overconfidence, and a series of desperate gambles that spiraled beyond control. In the summer of 1914, Berlin believed it held the winning hand. The plan, named for Count Alfred von Schlieffen, was supposed to be the masterpiece of Prussian military thought, a lightning strike through Belgium, crushing France in a matter of weeks before turning east to face the slow-moving Russians. It was a plan that depended on speed, precision, and the absolute faith that everything would unfold like clockwork. But war has a way of mocking plans. As the German columns marched through Belgium and northern France, the clock began to break. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Exhausted soldiers advanced faster than their food, their shells, and their reinforcements. The iron discipline of the German army, its greatest strength, turned against it when officers pushed their men beyond human endurance. Then, in early September at the Marne River, the French counterattacked with a desperation that stunned the invaders. The miracle of the Marne stopped Germany's momentum cold. It was the moment when the dream of a quick victory died. The war that was supposed to last weeks would instead last years, grinding through mud and blood until both sides forgot what victory even meant. By violating Belgian neutrality, Germany had also awakened a new enemy, Britain. The Royal Navy's blockade would become a slow but merciless weapon strangling Germany's food supply and trade. And as 1914 turned to 1915, the Western Front solidified into a nightmare, trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, where millions of men would die for a few hundred meters of mud. The German High Command still believed that courage and ingenuity could compensate for resources. But behind the barbed wire, reality was shifting. The war was no longer a contest of generals. It was a test of entire nations, their industries, their economies, their endurance. And in that kind of war, Germany's early brilliance would prove to be its undoing. Because once the lightning war failed, Berlin was trapped in a conflict it could not escape. A war that demanded total unity, perfect coordination, and the ability to feed both its army and its people through 4 long years of attrition. As the shells fell over Flanders and Verdun, and as new enemies joined the fight, the empire began to eat itself from the inside. The generals who once promised victory began to make mistakes that no amount of courage could erase. And those mistakes, one after another, would carry Germany inexorably toward its collapse in 1918. By 1915, the German Empire had settled into a grim rhythm of trench warfare. The guns thundered day and night, and the maps in Berlin barely changed. The lightning war had frozen into a war of endurance, a kind of slow-motion death where every meter of ground had to be bought with blood. Germany still held vast territories in the east and was holding its own in the west. But beneath the surface, the structure that had held the empire together was beginning to rot. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, but the generals at the top, men like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, refused to see the war as lost. They looked at the map and convinced themselves that one more push, one more offensive, could bring the Allies to their knees. What they did not understand was that Germany no longer faced a war of movement. It faced a war of exhaustion, and in that kind of struggle, mistakes became fatal. The first of those mistakes came at Verdun in 1916. General Erich von Falkenhayn's idea was brutally simple: to bleed France white. Verdun was chosen not for its strategic value but for its symbolism, an ancient fortress city whose fall would crush French morale. But instead of bleeding the French, Germany bled itself. The slaughter dragged on for 10 months, consuming over 700,000 lives and turning the soil of Verdun into a graveyard of an entire generation. The men who returned from that battlefield were no longer the invincible soldiers of 1914. They were ghosts wrapped in mud, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and disbelief. The Kaiser's empire could build more shells, but it could not rebuild that kind of faith. While Verdun raged, another battle, perhaps even more disastrous, was being fought not with bullets but with hunger. Britain's naval blockade began to strangle Germany's economy. Ships carrying food and fertilizer were turned away, and by 1917 starvation was not just a rumor, it was policy. In Berlin and Hamburg, children scavenged for turnips in the frost, and workers collapsed at their machines. The army might still have been fighting for victory, but the civilians were fighting to survive. Meanwhile, Germany's allies were crumbling. Austria-Hungary was a decaying skeleton of an empire, bleeding itself in the Carpathians. The Ottoman Turks were losing ground in the Middle East. The German leadership, once the model of organization, now lurched from one crisis to another. And then came another gamble, one that would prove catastrophic: the decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. The idea on paper was simple. If the U-boats could sink enough British merchant ships, the island nation would starve before America could react. It was the same logic that had guided Falkenhayn at Verdun. If total war could not be won by strategy, it could at least be won by desperation. But this decision ignored the one nation that had so far stayed mostly out of the bloodbath, the United States. When American ships began to go down, Washington's patience ended. In April 1917, America declared war on Germany, bringing to the Allied side not only new soldiers but an industrial power unmatched by any in Europe. For the German people, this decision felt like a turning point, one that few dared to speak of openly. The slogans of 1914, "Home by Christmas," had vanished. Instead, posters now spoke of endurance, sacrifice, duty, and the faces on those posters looked nothing like the men coming home from the front, sunken, hollow, and haunted. Still, in early 1918, Germany would take one last leap into the abyss, its final gamble, the Spring Offensive, a desperate attempt to crush Britain and France before the Americans arrived in force. And for a brief moment it almost worked. But the cost would be the destruction of the German army itself. By the winter of 1917, Germany stood at a crossroads between exhaustion and illusion. Russia had fallen into revolution, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and freeing nearly 1 million German soldiers from the Eastern Front. For the first time in years, victory seemed to flicker again on the horizon. The German High Command, led by the grim, unyielding figures of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, saw in this moment a final, desperate chance to turn the tide. They called it the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. It would be an offensive so vast, so violent, that it would shatter the Allies before American troops could fully arrive. On the morning of March 21, 1918, under a grey, trembling sky, more than 6,000 German guns opened fire along a 50-mile front. The bombardment was unlike anything the British Fifth Army had ever endured. Gas, high explosives, and a creeping barrage that turned the landscape into a storm of dust and iron. Then came the Sturmtruppen, stormtroopers, elite German soldiers trained for speed and infiltration. Moving in small, flexible groups, they bypassed strongpoints, struck at communication lines, and left chaos in their wake. By nightfall, the British front was broken. Entire divisions were overrun, and for a few fleeting days, the dream of victory seemed alive once more. All across Germany, church bells rang. Newspapers screamed that Paris was within reach. In Berlin cafes, officers toasted to the return of glory, to a peace dictated by the empire. But on the front, those same soldiers were walking into a grave. The offensives Michael, Georgette, Gneisenau, Blucher, York pushed the Allies back, yes, but without direction. The Germans advanced through shattered fields and villages already destroyed by years of war. There were no clear objectives, no lasting strategy. Supply lines collapsed under their own weight. The stormtroopers, the best men Germany had left, fell faster than they could be replaced. By July, the German army had gained land but lost its soul. Over 900,000 casualties had bled the empire dry. The men who survived were starving, exhausted, and disillusioned. They had marched forward for nothing but another line of trenches and another horizon of shell fire. When the French counterattacked at the Second Battle of the Marne, everything unraveled. Tanks rolled through gaps in the German line. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. And American divisions, young, well-fed, and burning with confidence, poured into the fight. On August 8, 1918, at Amiens, the German front finally cracked. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was psychological collapse. German units began surrendering by the hundreds. Desertions multiplied. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that they were tired of dying for generals who no longer believed in victory. Back home, the illusion of unity was shattering. In the shipyards of Kiel, sailors mutinied rather than sail out on a hopeless suicide mission against the British fleet. In the streets of Berlin, workers went on strike, chanting for bread and peace. The government tried to hide the truth, but rumors of collapse spread faster than any official proclamation. And as the empire began to tear itself apart, even its leaders lost faith. On October 3rd, Ludendorff, the same man who had demanded endless sacrifice, admitted what everyone already knew: the war was lost. By early November, the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin, and at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. But in the silence that followed, Germany's wounds were far from healed. The soldiers who returned home carried with them not pride but confusion and bitterness. They had not been defeated in battle. They were told they had been betrayed. The lie spread like a disease, whispering that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians, pacifists, and Jews. It was a myth born out of humiliation, but it would live on, and in time it would give birth to something far darker. Because Germany's defeat in 1918 was not just the end of one war, it was the beginning of the next. In the winter of 1918, as the smoke cleared from Europe's battlefields, Germany lay in a strange kind of twilight, defeated, starving, and yet somehow still defiant. The empire that had marched to war with banners and brass bands now existed only in memory. Its Kaiser was gone, its generals disgraced, its cities half-starved, and its people divided between exhaustion and anger. But the deeper wounds were not carved into the land. They were carved into the German mind. When the armistice was signed on November 11th, many Germans simply couldn't comprehend that it was over. Their armies were still deep inside France and Belgium. No foreign soldier had set foot in Berlin. How then could they have lost? The generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg had no interest in admitting their mistakes. Instead, they quietly handed power to civilian politicians, forcing them to bear the humiliation of surrender. It was a calculated move, and it worked. Within weeks, a poisonous idea began to spread, the Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back myth. According to this tale, Germany's brave soldiers had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed at home by pacifists, by socialists, by Jews, by the very men who had signed the armistice. It was a lie, but it offered a comforting illusion that the empire had been undone not by misjudgment and exhaustion, but by treachery. It was easier to believe in betrayal than to face the truth that Germany's great gamble had simply failed. While the generals nursed their pride, the politicians who inherited the wreckage faced an impossible task. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was meant to ensure peace. Instead, it deepened every wound it touched. The Allies, especially France, demanded reparations so vast they seemed designed to humiliate rather than rebuild. Germany was stripped of its colonies, its navy, its pride, and vast stretches of land. The Rhineland was demilitarized, the Saar placed under foreign control, and Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. But perhaps the most bitter blow of all was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which declared that Germany bore full responsibility for the war and all its devastation. For many Germans, this was intolerable. The generation that had endured 4 years in the trenches now felt their suffering reduced to shame. In the streets of Berlin, posters and pamphlets cried out that the Republic had been born from betrayal. The same soldiers who had mutinied in 1918 now found themselves despised as symbols of failure. Paramilitary groups, Freikorps, former soldiers with no place in peacetime, roamed the cities, suppressing revolts with brutality and feeding the atmosphere of chaos and revenge. For ordinary Germans, the years that followed were a slow descent into despair. Hyperinflation wiped out savings overnight. Children played with stacks of worthless banknotes while their parents bartered wedding rings for bread. Political violence became daily routine, communists clashed with nationalists, and assassinations became a language of politics. Through it all, the old myth refused to die. The generals who had led Germany to ruin now painted themselves as victims of conspiracy. Hindenburg, one of those same architects of disaster, would even become president of the new Weimar Republic, a state he barely believed in. And in the smoky beer halls of Munich, a young veteran named Adolf Hitler listened, learned, and found in that myth a weapon. For Hitler, the stab in the back was not a delusion. It was destiny. He transformed the pain of 1918 into a promise of vengeance, the humiliation of Versailles into a call for rebirth. He told the broken soldiers that they had been right all along, that Germany had never truly lost, only been betrayed. And millions, desperate for meaning in a world that no longer made sense, believed him. By the time the 1930s arrived, the scars of the First World War had not healed, they had only hardened. The same steel that had forged the empire now forged something darker. And the world, still haunted by the memory of 1914, would soon discover that Germany's defeat in the First World War had not been an ending at all. It had been the prologue to an even greater catastrophe. Germany in the aftermath of November 1918 was not a nation at peace. It was a nation suspended in disbelief. Its streets were full of people who could not decide whether to celebrate or to mourn. On one corner stood the workers, newly empowered, waving red flags and speaking of democracy and freedom. On the other, gaunt veterans in tattered uniforms, eyes hollow from years in the trenches, cursing the politicians they believed had stolen their victory. The air smelled of coal smoke and defeat. The Weimar Republic was born not out of triumph, but necessity. Its founders were not conquerors or revolutionaries, but exhausted men trying to hold back chaos. In the Reichstag, the old aristocrats sneered at the new leaders. Outside, hunger riots flared. The winter of 1919 was one of the coldest in memory, and for millions of families the war never really ended. It merely changed shape. The blockade imposed by the British Navy continued even after the armistice, keeping food scarce. In some towns, children starved to death months after the peace had been signed. The German army, the proud machine that had once terrified Europe, was a shell of itself. Millions of men drifted home from the front lines, their faces pale and their hands trembling, haunted by nightmares that had no name yet. What we now call shell shock. They came back to a country that no longer knew how to receive them. There were no parades, no medals, no glory. The veterans were told that the empire they had fought for no longer existed. Among them were tens of thousands of men who would later form the Freikorps, private paramilitary groups that operated somewhere between nationalism and anarchy. They wore their old uniforms, kept their weapons, and roamed the streets fighting communists, strikers, or anyone they saw as un-German. They told themselves they were protecting the fatherland from Bolshevism, but in truth they were protecting a dream, the dream that Germany's defeat had been a lie. In Berlin, power shifted daily. The Kaiser's palace was empty, the flag of the monarchy replaced by the black, red, and gold of the Republic. The new chancellor, Friedrich Ebert, tried to impose order, but the situation was like trying to mend a dam with bare hands. The Spartacist uprising, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, sought to turn Germany into a workers' state modelled after the Bolsheviks. Ebert turned to the Freikorps for help, and in January 1919 they crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured, beaten, and murdered. Their bodies were dumped into the Landwehr Canal, a message to anyone who dared to challenge the fragile new order. But the violence did not end there. From the Baltic to Bavaria, Germany became a battlefield once more. not between nations but within itself. Local republics were declared and destroyed one after another. In Munich, anarchists briefly ruled. In the Ruhr, workers seized factories. In Saxony, a Red Army of miners rose and fell within weeks. All the while, the shadow of Versailles grew larger. In June 1919, the German delegation, a handful of nervous diplomats and exhausted officials, travelled to France to sign the treaty. They were not invited to negotiate. They were summoned to accept. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, under the painted ceilings where Wilhelm I had once been crowned Emperor of a united Germany, they signed their humiliation. They called it the Diktat, the dictated peace. The reparations were staggering. 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast that no one could even imagine how to pay it. The Allies demanded the surrender of the German Navy, the limitation of its army to 100,000 men, and the loss of colonies that stretched from Africa to the Pacific. The industrial heartland of the Saar was placed under foreign control. But most painful of all was that single sentence, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, declaring Germany and its allies solely responsible for the war and its devastation. To the Allies, it was a legal necessity. To the Germans, it was an insult beyond measure. Even those who had opposed the war saw it as a deliberate humiliation. In Berlin, nationalist newspapers began to print headlines in thick black letters: shame, betrayal, chains of Versailles. Veterans marched through the streets carrying banners that read, "The German army undefeated in the field," words that would soon harden into myth. The men who had actually led the army, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, were only too happy to let the myth grow. They appeared before commissions and claimed that Germany had been on the verge of victory when the politicians had stabbed them in the back. It was a lie born of pride, but it spread faster than any truth could. It gave shape to the confusion and despair of millions who could not understand how everything they had believed in had vanished in a single year. And from that lie, the soil of the next catastrophe began to form. In the beer halls of Munich, in the smoky gatherings of disillusioned veterans and failed revolutionaries, men began to dream again not of peace but of vengeance. One of them was a former corporal named Adolf Hitler, who had spent the last days of the war lying half-blind in a hospital bed, weeping as he heard of Germany's surrender. He, too, believed the lie. He would build his entire movement upon it. Meanwhile, for ordinary Germans, survival became a daily calculation. The mark collapsed. Prices doubled, then tripled, then became meaningless. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost millions. People pushed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy groceries. Pensioners froze to death because they could no longer afford coal. Parents tore up old family Bibles just to keep their children warm. Yet amidst the despair, something else was stirring, a dark kind of energy, a longing for order and meaning. Many Germans convinced themselves that democracy had failed them, that only strength could restore pride. And that is what made the memory of 1918 so dangerous, because it was not just a memory of defeat, it was a wound that refused to close. The republic that had been born in blood and starvation would survive its first years, but not its ghosts. For every man who accepted peace, another waited for revenge. For every family that rebuilt, another kept the old flag hidden in a drawer. The Great War had ended, but in the silence it left behind, the next one had already begun to whisper. The 1920s in Germany were years of haunting contradictions, a nation trying to dance while bleeding, to rebuild while still standing in ruins. In Berlin, jazz and cabaret glittered under the gaslight. The cafes overflowed with new art and poetry, and yet, only a few blocks away, families boiled wallpaper glue for dinner, scraping the paste for calories. This was the Weimar Republic, fragile, brilliant, and doomed. At first, the Republic tried to hold itself together through compromise, but the wound of 1918 was too deep, and the Treaty of Versailles too bitter to ignore. The government in Berlin faced an impossible choice: obey the Allies and pay the reparations, or risk invasion. Each option tore the nation further apart. The left saw obedience as betrayal. The right saw the Republic itself as treason. In 1920, the first blow came: the Kapp Putsch. A group of right-wing officers, including Freikorps veterans, marched on Berlin demanding the restoration of the old imperial order. For a few terrifying days, the government fled, and the coup seemed destined to succeed. But then something extraordinary happened. The workers of Berlin went on strike, shutting down railways, power stations, and newspapers. The coup collapsed, but so too did the illusion that the army would defend democracy. The generals had stood aside, muttering that troops do not fire on troops. The message was clear: the Republic had no real defenders. Then came the spiral no one could control: hyperinflation. By 1923, the mark was disintegrating. A loaf of bread that had cost half a mark before the war now cost 200 billion. Housewives ran to the bakeries at dawn, their arms full of cash, before prices rose again by noon. Workers demanded wages twice a day, paid in sacks of paper they could barely carry home. Banknotes became cheaper than firewood. Children made kites out of them, and old men wept over pensions turned to dust. Photographs from the time look like hallucinations. Men pushing wheelbarrows of currency, farmers refusing to sell food because money had no meaning, children stacking bundles of bills like bricks. When France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, in January 1923, to force payment of reparations, national pride imploded. The German government ordered passive resistance. Workers refused to cooperate. Factories shut down, trains stopped running. It was patriotic defiance, but it destroyed the economy. Inflation turned to madness. People traded onions for boots or silver spoons for potatoes. Hunger hollowed out the cities once more. And yet, in the midst of ruin, some people grew rich. Industrialists and speculators with access to foreign currency bought entire factories for the price of a pair of shoes. Old resentments deepened. The poor starved, the middle class vanished, and the wealthy seemed immune. The seeds of hatred that had been planted in 1918 were now being watered by envy and despair. In Munich, the old capital of Bavaria, the air crackled with rage. Veterans still wearing their faded uniforms gathered in beer halls to curse the Republic, the Allies, and anyone they believed responsible for Germany's humiliation. Among them was a failed artist and former corporal, Adolf Hitler, who had discovered his gift for speaking the words that others only dared to think. In November 1923, he made his move alongside General Ludendorff, the same man who had once commanded armies on the Western Front. Hitler attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government. The beer hall putsch began with shouts and gunfire and ended with dead bodies in the street. Hitler was arrested, his followers scattered, but prison would not silence him. It would give him time to write. In the solitude of Landsberg prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to his loyal deputy Rudolf Hess. Page after page he poured his fury onto paper, against the Jews, against the politicians of Weimar, against the stab in the back. He turned the pain of a generation into ideology. And while his words were dismissed by most as the ravings of a failed agitator, the ideas found their way into the bloodstream of a broken nation. Because Hitler was not inventing hatred, he was harvesting it. By 1924, the inflation crisis ended abruptly when Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and secured loans from America under the Dawes Plan. The economy stabilized. Streets brightened. Music returned. The cafes of Berlin filled with laughter, and for a brief moment it seemed as if Germany might heal. But the scars were still there, just beneath the surface. Invisible but deadly. The Republic had survived its first decade, but not its curse. Millions had lost faith in democracy, seeing it as weak, compromised, foreign. They longed for strength, for someone who could restore the order and pride they remembered from the old empire. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it would rip open those scars again, and this time there would be no recovery. When the Wall Street stock market collapsed in October 1929, the shockwave did not stop in New York. It crossed the Atlantic, tore through London, and slammed into Germany like a second invisible war. The Weimar Republic, already fragile and divided, was hit harder than any other country on earth. The reason lay in the very thing that had briefly saved it: American money. Throughout the mid-1920s, Germany's recovery had been built not on its own strength, but on foreign loans. Under the Dawes Plan, billions of dollars poured in from the United States to rebuild factories, stabilize the mark, and pay reparations to the Allies. It was a fragile loop. America lent money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay France and Britain, and France and Britain used their share to repay debts to America. As long as everyone believed the system worked, it did. But when Wall Street collapsed, the illusion shattered overnight. American banks demanded repayment. Credit dried up. German factories that had only just reopened began to close again. Exports fell by half. Unemployment exploded from 1 million in 1929 to 6 million by 1932. Entire cities sank into silence. In Berlin, young men in long coats stood in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting for soup or for work that would never come. Families burned their furniture for heat. Farmers, unable to sell crops, watched their fields rot. Children went barefoot through the snow. In 1 year, industrial production fell by 40%, and wages by a third. The humiliation that had begun at Versailles now became personal. People who had lost everything in 1918 lost it again. The despair was not just economic, it was spiritual. Democracy, that fragile experiment born out of defeat, seemed powerless to protect anyone. Into this vacuum of faith and order, extremes returned. The political center, liberal, moderate, rational, began to collapse. On the streets, men in uniforms once again fought each other. The communists, KPD, waved red flags and called for revolution. The National Socialists, NSDAP, marched under the swastika and promised rebirth. Between them, the Weimar politicians pleaded for compromise, but no one was listening anymore. By 1930, Adolf Hitler's party, which had been a marginal movement only a few years earlier, began its meteoric rise. His message was intoxicatingly simple. Germany had been betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles was a crime. The Republic was a sham. He promised work, order, and vengeance, the three things the people longed for most. He spoke to veterans who still heard the echo of the trenches in their dreams. He spoke to mothers who had buried sons and now buried hope. He spoke to factory workers, ruined shopkeepers, and idealists who had watched their country lose its soul twice in a generation. And when he spoke, his voice trembled with conviction, with the same theatrical fury that once filled the beer halls of Munich. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag. The swastika banners hung from windows not as rebellion but as routine. The streets no longer belonged to the Republic but to mobs, marching, shouting, colliding, every night turning into a battlefield. The old generals who had once sneered at democracy now saw in Hitler a weapon, someone who could restore discipline, rebuild the army, and crush communism. They thought they could control him. They thought they could use him. They were wrong. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the same war hero who had presided over Germany's defeat, appointed Hitler as Chancellor. In that moment, the circle of history closed. The myth of 1918, the stab in the back, had taken its final revenge. From the ashes of the First World War, the seeds of the Second had fully sprouted, and as the flags of the new Reich rose over Berlin, many Germans cheered, believing at last that their humiliation was over. But for Europe, and for the world, it had only just begun. When Adolf Hitler took power in January 1933, he did not storm the gates of the Reichstag with armies. He walked through the front door, legally, and under the applause of those who thought they could tame him. The generals, the industrialists, the old aristocracy, they believed he was a tool, a populist instrument to restore order, silence the communists, and protect their privileges. But Hitler was not a tool. He was the embodiment of the rage that Germany had refused to confront since 1918. The republic that had been born from defeat was still alive in name, but in spirit it was already dead. Within months, the last fragile traces of democracy were dismantled. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, whether accidental or orchestrated, gave Hitler the pretext he needed to declare a national emergency. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. Political opponents were rounded up and imprisoned. The streets of Berlin, once filled with debate, were now filled with fear. In March, the Enabling Act was passed. It allowed Hitler to pass laws without parliamentary approval, effectively dissolving the very system that had given him power. He used that authority to outlaw other political parties, dissolve trade unions, and create the machinery of total control. Within a single year, the dream of Weimar democracy, that fragile, flickering light, was extinguished. And yet, to many Germans, life seemed to improve. Unemployment plummeted as Hitler launched vast public works projects, rebuilding highways, factories, and the military. The Versailles Treaty, long despised, was now openly defied. The German army expanded from 100,000 to over 1 million men. The Luftwaffe rose from the ashes in secret airfields. The Navy rebuilt its submarines. Industries that had once built tractors were now quietly turning out tanks. For a generation that had known nothing but humiliation, hunger, and chaos, this new order felt intoxicating. The cities gleamed again. The flags fluttered in the wind. Even those who despised Hitler's fanaticism admitted that he had given Germany a sense of direction. But beneath the parades and propaganda, the soul of the nation was being reforged, not into peace, but into vengeance. Hitler's speeches returned again and again to the same story: Germany had been betrayed in 1918. The Republic, he said, had been a conspiracy of Jews and traitors. The Peace of Versailles was a crime. The world had humiliated Germany, and now the world would pay. This myth, the stab in the back, was no longer whispered in taverns or scrawled on pamphlets. It was now the official truth, taught in schools, printed in textbooks, preached in pulpits, and shouted through radio speakers into every home. History itself was rewritten to feed the fire. The old generals who had once been his superiors now stood beside him in uniform, saluting. And yet, beneath the thunder of speeches and marching boots, something darker was taking shape. The ideology of purity and revenge. To Hitler, the defeat of 1918 had not been merely a military failure. It was a moral corruption. He blamed democracy for weakness, intellectualism for decay, and Jews for conspiracy. It was not enough for Germany to rise. It had to purge itself. Concentration camps began to appear in 1933, first for political opponents, then for anyone the new state deemed undesirable. In towns across Germany, neighbors disappeared overnight. Fear became a form of obedience. But Hitler's vision was never limited to Germany. From the moment he took power, he saw the entire world as a battlefield waiting to be redrawn. The failure of 1918 had been, in his eyes, a failure of will. The next war would not end in surrender. It would end in domination. In 1935, Germany reintroduced conscription, openly defying Versailles. The following year, the Rhineland, demilitarized since the end of the First World War, was reoccupied. French and British leaders, weary of conflict and still haunted by the last war, did nothing. The world watched, uneasy but silent. Each act of defiance made Hitler bolder. The myth had now completed its transformation. What began as an excuse for defeat had become a prophecy of conquest. By 1938, when German troops marched into Austria, they were greeted not with resistance but with flowers. The Anschluss was framed as a reunion of brothers, the resurrection of pride. And when Hitler turned his gaze to Czechoslovakia, to the Sudetenland, he claimed it too was merely the correction of Versailles. The West, desperate to avoid another war, gave in at Munich. Chamberlain returned to London declaring peace for our time. But Hitler was already planning otherwise. He told his generals that the German people were ready to avenge the shame of 1918, ready to prove to the world that Germany had never truly been defeated. The entire structure of the Third Reich, its economy, its education, its propaganda, existed for one purpose: to erase the memory of surrender through conquest. The seeds planted in the mud of the Western Front were about to bloom in fire. And as Europe drifted toward the abyss once more, no one yet realized that the ghost of 1918 was returning, not to be buried, but to finish what it had begun. By the late summer of 1939, the drums of war beat once more across Europe. 21 years after the guns of the First World War had fallen silent, Germany was again on the march, its banners black, white, and red, its people cheering with a zeal that bordered on delirium. The promise that Hitler had made since his first speeches, to undo the humiliation of Versailles, had become not only policy but destiny. For millions of Germans, it felt as though history itself had been rewritten. The nation that had once starved under blockade now seemed invincible. The generals, the same institution that had been broken by 1918, marched again in gleaming uniforms. Factories that had once lain silent now thundered day and night. Every speech, every parade, every film, every school lesson carried the same refrain: Nie wieder 1918. Never again 1918. But the price of erasing that defeat would be the destruction of Europe itself. When Hitler's armies invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, they did so under the illusion that this time Germany would strike fast enough, hard enough, to win before the world could react. It was the same dream that had guided the Schlieffen Plan a quarter-century earlier: victory through speed, precision, and shock. But now the machines were faster, the skies darker, and the consequences far beyond imagination. As German tanks rolled through Polish villages, entire cities were burned into silence. The Luftwaffe reduced Warsaw to rubble. The Blitzkrieg turned the plains of Europe into a mechanical storm. And in Berlin, the people rejoiced, not because they loved war, but because they believed they were finally undoing the injustice of the last one. In Hitler's mind, this was not a new war. It was the continuation of the old one, a reckoning deferred. The enemies were the same: France, Britain, and what he called the international conspirators, who had humiliated Germany in 1918. He told his generals that this war would not end in another armistice, nor in another betrayal. It would end in the annihilation of Germany's enemies. The German people believed him. For the first time since the Kaiser's armies had marched through Belgium, they felt united, by fear, by pride, and by propaganda. The same wounds that had never healed now became the fuel for conquest. And at first it seemed to work. Within months, Poland was gone. In 1940, the German army swept across the Low Countries, outflanked the Maginot Line, and took Paris in just 6 weeks, something their fathers had failed to do in 4 years. Soldiers who had grown up listening to stories of the trenches now stood in the French capital beneath the Eiffel Tower, triumphant. Hitler himself visited Paris at dawn, walking silently through the streets, his face lit with a strange private satisfaction. He had undone the shame of Versailles. He had reversed 1918. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed that the myth had been fulfilled. But the deeper truth was that Hitler's Germany had not escaped the curse of the First World War. It had only amplified it. The same arrogance, the same faith in total victory, the same contempt for compromise that had destroyed the Kaiser's empire were now destroying the Third Reich. As the war widened, first to the Balkans, then to the Soviet Union, the old lessons were forgotten once more. The German army repeated the same fatal errors of overreach and hubris. The front lines stretched thousands of kilometers. Supply chains broke down. Winter came, and with it, the ghosts of the past: hunger, frost, and despair. By 1943, Stalingrad became a second Verdun, a new symbol of German exhaustion. Hundreds of thousands of men surrounded, starving, dying in the snow. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, now shattered. And as before, the leadership refused to face the truth. But this time there would be no armistice. The Allies had learned from 1918. They would not stop at borders or settlements. They would crush Germany completely. By 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, the circle of history finally closed. The same cities that had once starved under blockade now burned beneath Allied bombs. The same empire that had once dreamed of glory ended again in ruin, but this time there would be no myth of betrayal to hide behind. The destruction was total, undeniable, absolute. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Führer was dead by his own hand. The capital was rubble. Millions were homeless, millions more displaced, and the nation that had once sought revenge for its first defeat now faced the full weight of its second, a defeat that would divide it in two for nearly half a century. And yet in that devastation a strange kind of peace was born. For the first time in its modern history, Germany was forced to look directly into the mirror, to confront not just its enemies but itself. The lesson of 1918 had never been that Germany was doomed to lose. It was that pride, unchecked and unexamined, can turn even victory into ruin. The First World War ended in armistice. The Second ended in ashes. But only in the silence that followed 1945 did Germany finally understand the truth. That its greatest enemy had never been France, Britain, or Russia. It had been the ghost of its own past. When the fires of 1945 finally died out, Europe stood still, not in victory, but in exhaustion. From the ruins of Berlin, from the bombed-out cities of Cologne and Dresden, from the shattered cathedrals and broken railways, the world looked upon Germany and saw not an empire, not a Reich, not an enemy, but a warning. For the first time in its modern history, Germany was silent. The parades were gone. The flags had burned away. The shouts that once echoed through the streets had turned into whispers. Millions of its soldiers were dead, millions of its civilians displaced, and the myth that had begun in 1918, that Germany had never truly lost, only been betrayed, was gone forever. In its place stood a kind of clarity, the kind that only absolute ruin can bring. The country that had twice sought to conquer Europe now faced a harder task: to conquer itself. The lessons it had refused to learn after 1918 now demanded to be learned in full. Pride, vengeance, myth, all of them had led to the same ending. The Kaiser's empire had fallen in arrogance, Hitler's in madness, and yet out of that devastation came something extraordinary: humility. For decades after the Second World War, the name Germany would mean ashes and memory, but slowly, painfully, it began to mean something else. From the division of East and West arose a new kind of nation, one that defined its strength not by conquest but by conscience. It rebuilt its cities not as monuments to empire but as testaments to endurance. Berlin, once a symbol of tyranny, became a crossroads of freedom. The same rail lines that had once carried soldiers to the front now carried students and thinkers across a continent that swore never to repeat the past. In the 1950s and 60s, Germany rebuilt brick by brick: factories, schools, theaters, hope. In the 1970s and 80s, it began to face its darkest truths openly: the war crimes, the genocide, the ideology that had poisoned its name. And by the 1990s, when the wall finally fell and the nation was made whole again, it emerged not as a power-seeking dominance, but as a power-seeking peace. It is one of history's rarest transformations, from the aggressor of 2 world wars to the moral center of a continent built on reconciliation. But that transformation came at a price, the price of memory, because in Germany, history is not just taught, it is lived. The ghosts of 1918 and 1945 still walk its streets. They are in the memorials of stone and bronze, in the silence of train stations, in the absence of what can never be rebuilt. They remind the living that forgetting is the first step toward repeating. The First World War began with confidence and ended in confusion. The Second began in revenge and ended in repentance. And between them lies the story of a nation that had to lose everything twice to understand what it truly meant to be free. Because in the end, the fall of Germany was not only a warning to the world, it was a mirror. Every empire that believes itself immune to error, every nation that builds its pride upon myth, every generation that confuses strength with wisdom, they all stand where Germany once stood, staring into the same abyss. History does not punish, it teaches. And in the lessons written in the ashes of Berlin, Verdun, and Stalingrad, there lies the clearest truth of all. A country can rebuild its cities, it can even rebuild its armies. But it can never rebuild its innocence. The story of Germany's fall is not a tale of villains and victims. It is a mirror held up to civilization itself. From the thunder of 1914 to the silence of 1945, it reminds us how nations lose their way not through weakness but through pride, not through ignorance but through the refusal to listen. In the end, no army conquered Germany more completely than the truth. And from those ashes came something fragile yet enduring, a peace built not on triumph but on understanding, because only when a people dares to face its past can it finally shape its future. So as the echoes of the last century fade into history, one question still remains: not why Germany lost, but whether the world has learned why it mattered. Fade to black, strings rise, archival footage of Berlin rebuilding dissolves into color. The screen lingers on the words, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." George Santayana.